question had been asked before, many times, in many rooms, by many people who already knew what they believed before they finished the sentence. But on that particular afternoon in October 1993, inside a conference room on the fourth floor of the New York Public Library, the question landed differently. Because this time, Gore Vidal was in the chair. And Gore Vidal, unlike most people, always answered. The panel was called Literature in the Age of Noise, a somewhat grandiose title for what was, in practice, a moderately attended discussion among writers, critics, and academics who had gathered to argue about whether popular culture had anything left to offer language. The room held perhaps 90 people. The chairs were the kind with thin cushions that become uncomfortable in the second hour. A water pitcher sat between the panelists, untouched. Vidal was 78 years old that autumn. He had written 25 novels, several of which had become canonical. He had argued with Norman Mailer on television and considered it a minor footnote. He had lived in Rome, in Ravello, on the Amalfi Coast, in a house with a view of the sea, and had decided long ago that most of what Americans called culture was, in fact, noise dressed in the clothes of culture. He held this opinion firmly and without apology. He was also, on this particular afternoon, in a good mood. The moderator was a critic named James Farrell, a man in his early 40s who wrote for a literary journal that paid very little and was read by a very specific kind of person. He had sandy hair, a tendency to lean forward when he spoke, and the particular energy of someone who had prepared more than the situation required. He had notes, several pages of them. The panel had spent the first 40 minutes on familiar ground: the death of the novel, the collapse of the attention span, the question of whether television had killed something that could not be revived. Vidal had offered several observations, each of them precise, some of them funny, and one or two that drew the kind of silence that only happens when someone has said something so accurate it briefly embarrasses the room. Then Farrell turned to the question he had been building toward. He asked it carefully, almost tentatively, as if he knew what was coming but felt obligated to walk through the door anyway. Can rock music produce literature? Can popular song lyrics, in their current form, contain genuine literary value? Vidal set down his pen. He did not answer immediately. He looked at the water pitcher for a moment, then looked back at Farrell, and something in his expression suggested that the question itself was not the problem. The question was fine. The question was even interesting in a limited way. The problem was the answer. No, he said, and then he explained why. He was not contemptuous about it. That was the thing people who disliked Vidal often misunderstood. He was not a man who enjoyed cruelty. He was a man who enjoyed precision. There is a difference. Contempt is sloppy. Precision requires attention. He said that lyrics, by their nature, existed in service of music. They were not meant to stand alone. When you removed the melody, what remained was rarely interesting. He cited examples. Famous songs whose words printed on a page collapsed under the weight of scrutiny. He said that the great American art forms of the 20th century had been jazz and the novel, and that rock music, for all its cultural energy, had not produced a writer in the literary sense. It had produced performers, stylists, personalities. These were not the same thing. He was not unkind about it. He simply did not believe it. Farrell listened. He took a few notes. He nodded in places. Then he reached into the manila folder beside his water glass and removed 2 pages. He had printed them himself that morning in his office, on a printer that was slightly low on ink. He said he wanted to read something. He asked Vidal if he would listen. Vidal gestured, very slightly with one hand. The gesture meant, "Go ahead." Farrell read slowly. He read from the lyrics of Pennyroyal Tea, then a passage from Dumb, then the opening verses of Something in the Way. He read them without introducing the artist. He had decided deliberately not to say the name first. He wanted Vidal to hear the words before the context arrived. The room was quiet, not the polite quiet of an audience waiting for the next speaker, a different kind of quiet, the kind that accumulates when something unexpected is happening and no one wants to be the first to acknowledge it. Farrell finished reading. He set the pages down. He looked at Vidal. Vidal had not moved. His hands were folded in front of him on the table. His expression had not changed in any dramatic way, but something had shifted in it, something that required a moment to locate. Farrell asked, "Do you know who wrote those?" Vidal said he did not. Farrell told him, "The name landed in the room the way names sometimes do when the context is unexpected. Kurt Cobain, 26 years old. Aberdeen, Washington. A man who wore second-hand cardigans and did not give interviews he could avoid, and had spent most of the previous 2 years being photographed in a state that looked, in retrospect, like exhaustion." Vidal said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "Read the last one again." Farrell read it again. Something in the Way was not a song most people thought of first when they thought of Nirvana. It was not Smells Like Teen Spirit, which had arrived 2 years earlier, like something thrown through a window. It was not Come As You Are, which radio stations could play without frightening their advertisers. It was the last track on Nevermind, a song that sounded like it had been recorded at the bottom of a well, a cello underneath it, a voice that seemed to be speaking from a place just below the surface of language. Farrell read the words. They are not long. The song itself is barely 2 minutes. But the words, separated from the music, separated from the distorted hum of the recording, did something unusual on the page. They did not collapse. They held their shape. They contained within them a specific kind of grief, not theatrical, not performed, not reaching for effect. The kind of grief that exists before it has found a name for itself. Vidal listened. When Farrell finished, the room held its quiet for another few seconds. Then someone in the third row coughed, and the spell broke, and the world resumed its ordinary pace. Vidal picked up his pen. He looked at the table. He turned the pen over once in his fingers. Then he said quietly, to no one in particular, "That's not nothing." He did not recant. It would be inaccurate to say he recanted. He did not stand up and declare that rock music had been literature all along, that he had been wrong, that he was sorry. Gore Vidal was not built for that particular gesture and would not have offered it even if someone had asked. But that's not, nothing is not a small thing to say. Not from him, not in that room, not after 30 years of believing, with genuine conviction, that popular music was a cultural cul-de-sac, energetic and sincere, and ultimately without consequence to literature. That's not nothing means, I did not expect this. It means I was measuring with the wrong instrument. It means something got through. Farrell, who would write about that afternoon many years later, said that what struck him was not the words themselves. Though the words surprised him too, the first time he'd read them, sitting in his apartment with the lyrics pulled from a magazine. What struck him was the moment before Vidal spoke. The silence. The way Vidal set down his pen and looked at the table and seemed to be doing something private and internal, something that had nothing to do with the audience or the panel or the questions he had come prepared to answer. He was, Farrell thought, listening. Really listening. The way you listen when something has arrived that you were not expecting, and you need a moment to understand what it is and where it came from. Kurt Cobain was not there. He was in Seattle or on tour or somewhere between those 2 points, doing the thing he had always done, which was making music that sounded like it had been pulled out of somewhere difficult. He was not thinking about Gore Vidal. He was probably not thinking about literature. He was thinking about the next chord or the next line, or the particular problem of how to say something true without it sounding like you were trying. That was always the problem for him, how to say something true without it sounding like you were trying. The songs on In Utero, which had been released a month before the panel in New York, answered that problem in ways that made critics uncomfortable. Not because they were inaccessible, because they were the opposite of inaccessible. They were transparent in a way that popular music rarely allowed itself to be. You could hear through them. They did not hide anything behind craft or irony or the comfortable distance of performance. They said what they said, and they meant it. And if that made you uneasy, then perhaps the unease was the point. Rape Me was not a song that literary critics had spent time with. Frances Farmer Will Have Her Revenge on Seattle was not a lyric that had made it into the anthologies. But read on a page, stripped of the noise and the feedback and the particular grain of his voice, they did something unexpected. They worked. Not in the way that Bob Dylan's lyrics worked, which was the approved comparison. the safe harbor that critics reached for when they needed to argue that rock music could be serious. Dylan's lyrics had a bardic quality, a folk tradition behind them, a literary lineage you could trace. You could explain Dylan. You could footnote him. Cobain was harder to explain. His words did not come from a tradition. They came from somewhere more private, and that was what made them difficult to hold at a critical distance. They did not give you the tools to analyze them. They just sat there, on the page, being what they were. Farrell included the exchange in an essay he published the following spring in the same literary journal that paid very little. He did not make it the centerpiece. He buried it near the end, 3 paragraphs from the bottom. After a longer discussion of the panel's other moments, he was not sure at the time whether it was worth highlighting. The essay received modest attention, several letters to the editor, one response from a professor at Columbia who argued that Vidal's comment had been misinterpreted, that "that's not nothing" was a dismissal rather than a concession, a way of saying this exists but barely. Farrell wrote back a short reply in which he said politely that the professor had not been in the room. There is something that happens when you are in a room with someone who has just been surprised by something they did not think could surprise them. It is not loud. It does not announce itself. But it is unmistakable. The surprise is in the quality of the silence that follows, in the way the body adjusts itself, in the particular pause before the person speaks, during which they are deciding, perhaps for the first time, that their previous position needs at minimum a small revision. Vidal paused for a long time before he said, "That's not nothing." That pause was the real answer. In the years after Cobain's death in April 1994, Vidal was occasionally asked about music. He generally deflected. His interests lay elsewhere, and he had never been a man who felt obligated to expand his enthusiasms beyond what genuinely held his attention. But in a 1998 interview, deep in a conversation about American culture and the particular failures of the 20th century's second half, the interviewer mentioned the MTV Unplugged performance, the one from November 1993, a month after the New York panel, the one that had been filmed in a television studio decorated with stargazer lilies and black candles and had looked, to some people who watched it, less like a concert and more like something else. Vidal said he had seen it. The interviewer waited. Vidal said, "There's a version of that boy that would have written something important if he'd been given more time." Then he changed the subject, and the interview moved on, and the comment was not followed up. But that version of that boy is a specific kind of statement. It implies that another version also existed. The one you saw, the one in the cardigan, at the microphone, singing other people's songs alongside his own in a room that felt like a vigil. That version, the one who actually existed in time, had already written something important. Vidal knew it. He just hadn't found the language for it yet. Some people arrive at their admission slowly. That is not weakness. That is the particular honesty of someone who takes the question seriously enough to actually reconsider. The panel transcript was filed in a box in a basement archive at the New York Public Library. The box also contains the notes Farrell used that afternoon, slightly crumpled, with 2 passages from the Cobain lyrics underlined in ballpoint pen. One of the underlined passages is from Something in the Way. The other is from Dumb. The lyrics are not annotated. There are no margin notes explaining their significance or their literary antecedents or the tradition from which they emerged. They are just underlined, which is what you do when you read something and you want to remember where it was. When you are not sure yet what it means, but you know, with the certainty that precedes understanding, that it means something. Farrell had printed those pages for one reason. He had suspected, going into that room, that the words could hold their own. He was not certain. You are never certain until the words are read aloud in front of someone who does not want to be moved, and they are moved anyway. That is the test that matters. Not the review, not the theory, not the framework. The test is, does it survive the room? Kurt Cobain's words survived the room. Gore Vidal heard them and set down his pen and looked at the table and said, eventually very quietly, "That's not nothing." And in the particular language of a man who had spent 78 years saying exactly what he meant and nothing more, that was everything.